The stagecoach rattled down the dusty road toward El Dorado, Kansas, in the summer of 1875, carrying Catherine Mason with nothing but a small valise and the weight of desperation. The purple-blue bruise encircling her right eye throbbed with each jolt of the coach wheels against the uneven terrain. She kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the silhouette of the small frontier town was just beginning to take shape against the golden prairie backdrop. This was to be her new beginning, her escape, her last chance, and she prayed that the man waiting for her would be nothing like the one she'd left behind. Matthew Young stood at the edge of town, his worn boots planted firmly in the Kansas dirt, squinting against the afternoon sun as he watched the approaching stagecoach. His weathered Stetson cast a shadow across his tanned face, partially concealing the mixture of anticipation and apprehension in his eyes. At 32, he had finally saved enough from his cattle ranch to afford the luxury of companionship, a wife to share his modest success and the loneliness of frontier living. "Today's the day, ain't it?" Sheriff Thomas Parker stepped up beside him, chewing thoughtfully on a piece of straw. Matthew nodded, adjusting his clean blue shirt, the nicest he owned. "Yes, Miss Mason should be arriving on this coach." "Nervous?" the sheriff grinned. "A man would be a fool not to be," Matthew replied, his hand unconsciously moving to smooth down his recently trimmed beard. He had exchanged letters with Catherine Mason for the past 6 months, each correspondence revealing a woman of intelligence and gentle humor. He had chosen her advertisement in the matrimonial column carefully, drawn to her straightforward writing and lack of pretense. The stagecoach lurched to a stop in a cloud of dust, and Matthew stepped forward as the driver secured the reins. The door swung open, and a small, gloved hand appeared, followed by the figure of a woman in a simple blue traveling dress. As she turned to face him, Matthew's breath caught in his throat. Her auburn hair was neatly pinned beneath a modest bonnet, her features delicate and fair, but it was the dark bruise around her right eye that made his blood run cold. "Miss Mason?" he asked, stepping forward and offering his hand. She nodded, her chin lifting slightly as she met his gaze with her good eye. "Mr. Young, it's a pleasure to finally meet you." Her voice carried the soft lilt of the East, but there was steel beneath the gentility. Matthew felt a surge of protective anger as he looked at her injury, but he kept his voice steady. "The pleasure is mine. Welcome to El Dorado." He helped her down, noticing how she winced slightly at his touch. The driver handed down her small valise, a meager collection of belongings for someone starting a new life. "Would you like to rest before we head to the ranch?" Matthew asked. "There's a hotel. If it's all the same to you, I'd prefer to go directly to the ranch," she replied, her words clipped with what might have been fear or determination. "I've traveled a long way." Matthew nodded, taking her valise in one hand while offering her his arm with the other. She hesitated for the briefest moment before accepting it. Sheriff Parker tipped his hat as they passed. "Madam," he greeted, his eyes lingering on her bruise before flickering to Matthew with an unspoken question. "Sheriff," she acknowledged with a small nod. As they walked toward Matthew's wagon, he could feel the stares of the townspeople. El Dorado wasn't large, and newcomers, especially those arriving with visible injuries, were subject to curiosity and speculation. He helped her onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. Before flicking the reins, he turned to her, his voice low but firm. "Miss Mason, Catherine, I don't know what happened before you came here, and you don't have to tell me until you're ready, but I want you to know this. No one touches you again. Not while I'm alive." Catherine's composure faltered for just a moment, her green eyes widening in surprise before she regained control. "Mr. Young, Matthew, please." "Matthew," she amended. "You don't know me, you don't know what." "I know enough," he interrupted gently. "I know you're brave enough to travel across the country to marry a stranger. I know you write letters that made me laugh more than I have in years, and I know that no woman deserves to be struck, no matter the reason." He paused, then added, "We don't have to get married right away. You can stay as my guest until you decide if this is what you want." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she quickly brushed it away. "Thank you," she whispered. Matthew nodded, then flicked the reins. The wagon rolled forward, leaving El Dorado behind as they headed toward the open prairie and the ranch that lay 5 miles beyond town. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but filled with unspoken questions. Catherine took in the vast expanse of grassland, so different from the crowded streets of Philadelphia she had left behind. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the rolling hills, and in the distance, she could see a herd of cattle grazing. "Is that your ranch?" she asked, pointing toward a cluster of buildings that had appeared on the horizon. Matthew nodded. "It's not much compared to some, but it's mine. 160 acres, 50 head of cattle, a good barn, and a house that stood up to 3 Kansas winters." There was pride in his voice. "It's taken 8 years to build it up from nothing." "It sounds wonderful," she said softly, meaning it. After the cramped rooms she had shared with her uncle's family, the open space and fresh air felt like liberation. As they drew closer, Catherine could make out a modest 2-story farmhouse with a wide front porch, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. A wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, and as they approached, the front door opened to reveal an older woman with silver hair twisted into a practical knot. "That's Mrs. Winters," Matthew explained. "She comes from town 3 times a week to help with cooking and cleaning. I told her you were arriving today." The wagon rolled to a stop, and Matthew jumped down before coming around to help Catherine. His hands were strong but gentle on her waist as he lifted her to the ground. She tried not to wince as his fingers pressed against bruises hidden beneath her clothing. "Mrs. Winters," Matthew called, "this is Miss Catherine Mason." The older woman hurried down the steps, her kind face creased with concern as she took in Catherine's appearance. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, taking Catherine's hands in her own. "Come inside. I've got supper waiting and hot water for a bath if you'd like." "Thank you," Catherine replied, warmed by the woman's motherly concern. "A bath sounds heavenly after such a long journey." "Matthew, bring in her things," Mrs. Winters instructed, already guiding Catherine toward the house. "I've prepared the spare bedroom." As Catherine stepped into the house, she was struck by its simple comfort. The main room served as both parlor and dining area, with a stone fireplace at one end and a solid oak table at the other. Braided rugs covered portions of the wooden floor, and the windows were hung with checkered curtains. It was modest but clean and welcoming, nothing like the cold elegance of her uncle's Philadelphia home. "The bathroom is through there," Mrs. Winters said, pointing to a door off the main room. "It's not fancy, but there's a proper tub and running water." Matthew had it put in last year, quite progressive for these parts. Catherine's surprise must have shown on her face, for Mrs. Winters chuckled. "Our Matthew isn't your typical cowboy. He believes in making improvements when they make sense." "I'll take your bag upstairs," Matthew said from behind them, his deep voice startling Catherine. She hadn't heard him enter. "Thank you," she said, turning to face him. The concern in his eyes made her uncomfortable, not because it wasn't genuine, but because she wasn't accustomed to such consideration. Once Matthew had gone upstairs, Mrs. Winters lowered her voice. "He's a good man, Miss Mason, the best in these parts." "Whatever you're running from," she glanced meaningfully at Catherine's black eye, "you're safe here." "I don't know what you mean," Catherine said automatically, the defensive response ingrained after years of keeping secrets. Mrs. Winters merely patted her arm. "When you're ready to talk about it, I'm a good listener. Now go have your bath while I finish supper." The bathroom was simple but modern by frontier standards. A large copper tub stood in the center, already filled with steaming water. A cake of soap and a clean towel had been set on a small table nearby. Catherine closed the door and began to unbutton her travel-worn dress, each movement revealing new pain from the bruises that covered her back and ribs. As she sank into the warm water, she allowed herself to cry silently for the first time since leaving Philadelphia. She thought of her parents, both lost to influenza when she was 16, leaving her in the care of her father's brother. Uncle James had seemed kind at first, offering her a home and education, but his true nature emerged after she declined a marriage proposal from his business partner, a man 30 years her senior with a reputation for cruelty. The beating that followed had been severe, leaving her with the black eye that was now fading to yellowish green and bruises across her body. That night, she had taken what money she had saved from teaching at the local school and responded to Matthew Young's advertisement for a bride. His letters had seemed sincere, his descriptions of Kansas life honest about both its hardships and rewards. It had been a desperate gamble, but one that had seemed her only escape. Now, soaking in the warm water of a stranger's home, Catherine wondered if she had merely traded one uncertain situation for another. Matthew seemed kind, but so had Uncle James at first. Still, there had been something in Matthew's eyes when he promised that no one would hurt her again, a steadiness that inspired trust despite her better judgment. After washing away the dust of travel, Catherine dressed in her cleanest dress and pinned up her damp hair. When she emerged, the aroma of roast chicken and fresh bread filled the house, making her stomach growl in reminder that she'd eaten little on her journey. Matthew stood when she entered the dining area, pulling out a chair for her. "You look refreshed," he said simply, his eyes carefully avoiding her bruise. "I feel much better, thank you," she replied, taking the seat. Mrs. Winters brought out platters of food: roast chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, fresh bread, and green beans from the garden. "Eat up," she encouraged. "You look like you could use some meat on those bones." The meal passed pleasantly, with Matthew telling her about the ranch, the spring calving, the challenges of the previous winter, his plans for expanding the herd. He spoke with passion about his work but without boasting, and Catherine found herself relaxing as the conversation flowed naturally. "I should head back to town before dark," Mrs. Winters said as they finished eating. "I'll be back the day after tomorrow to check on you, Miss Mason." "I'll hitch up the wagon," Matthew offered, rising from his chair. Once they were alone, Catherine began clearing the table, needing to keep her hands busy. "Your home is lovely," she said. "Much nicer than I expected." "What did you expect?" Matthew asked, genuinely curious. She paused, a plate in her hands. "I'm not sure. Something rougher, I suppose. Your letters mentioned hardship." "There is hardship," he acknowledged. "Winters can be brutal, droughts kill crops, and sometimes the cattle get sick, but that doesn't mean we can't have comfort where possible." He hesitated, then added, "I want you to be comfortable here, Catherine. I know this isn't easy coming to a strange place, to a man you've only known through letters." "It was my choice," she said quietly, resuming her task of clearing the table. "Was it?" Matthew's voice was gentle, but his question cut to the heart of the matter. "Or was it the only choice you felt you had?" Catherine froze, her back to him, the stack of plates trembling slightly in her hands. "Does it matter?" she asked finally. "It matters to me," he replied. "I don't want a wife who's here because she's trapped. I want someone who chooses to stay, even knowing the difficulties." She turned to face him, her chin raised despite the fear coursing through her. "And if I choose not to stay?" "Then I'll give you the money to go wherever you want," he said simply. "I meant what I said earlier. You're not a prisoner here, Catherine." Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Winters calling from outside that the wagon was ready. Matthew excused himself to drive her back to town, leaving Catherine alone in the house that might or might not become her home. While he was gone, Catherine explored the house more thoroughly. The downstairs consisted of the main room, the bathroom, and a small study filled with bookshelves. She ran her fingers along the spines, surprised to find volumes of poetry, history, and literature alongside practical farming manuals. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, Matthew's, her own, and a smaller one that appeared unused. She was standing by the window in her bedroom, watching the sun set over the prairie when she heard the wagon return. A moment later, Matthew's boots sounded on the stairs, followed by a gentle knock at her open door. "I brought your valise up," he said, setting the small bag inside the door. "Is there anything else you need tonight?" "No, thank you," she replied, turning to face him. "This is more than enough," he nodded, lingering in the doorway. "I know it's not proper for us to be here alone, but I thought you might prefer privacy over staying in town where people would ask questions." "I appreciate that," she said sincerely. "Catherine," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "I don't expect anything from you. The door has a lock, and I'll be in my room across the hall if you need anything." He paused, then added, I'd like to hear your story someday when you're ready to tell it, but you don't owe me explanations. She studied his face in the fading light, the strong line of his jaw beneath his neatly trimmed beard, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and squinting into the sun, the earnestness in his expression. He wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was character in his features, reliability in his steady gaze. "Thank you," she said simply, unable to offer more. He nodded once, then turned to go. "Good night, Catherine. Good night, Matthew." After he left, she closed the door and turned the key in the lock, more from habit than fear. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the prairie night so different from Philadelphia's ceaseless urban noise. Eventually, the rhythmic chorus of crickets lulled her into a dreamless sleep. The morning brought new challenges as Catherine adjusted to ranch life. She rose early, determined to prove her usefulness. By the time Matthew came in from his dawn chores, she had coffee brewing and biscuits in the oven. "You didn't need to do that," he said, removing his hat as he entered. "I want to earn my keep," she replied, pouring him a cup of coffee. "You're not a servant, Catherine." "Neither am I a charity case," she countered, her voice sharper than intended. She softened her tone. "I've always worked, Matthew. I was a school teacher in Philadelphia. I don't know how to be idle." He accepted the coffee with a nod of understanding. "We could use a school teacher in El Dorado." "The current one is planning to return east this fall." The suggestion surprised her. "You wouldn't mind if I taught." "Why would I mind? It's a respectable profession and you'd be good at it." He sipped his coffee. "These are good biscuits." The simple compliment warmed her more than it should have. "Thank you." Over breakfast, Matthew outlined his plans for the day. "I need to ride out to check on the herd and mend some fencing on the north pasture. I should be back by mid-afternoon." "May I see the rest of the ranch while you're gone?" Catherine asked. "I'd like to familiarize myself with my surroundings." "Of course. Just be careful near the corral. The new mare is still a bit skittish." He hesitated, then added, "There's a small garden behind the house that could use some attention if you're so inclined. Mrs. Winters hasn't had time for it lately." After Matthew rode out, Catherine explored the property. The barn was larger than it appeared from a distance, housing 6 horses in clean stalls and storage for hay and grain. A chicken coop near the house contained a dozen clucking hens, and she gathered fresh eggs for tomorrow's breakfast. The garden was overgrown but salvageable, and she spent the morning weeding and harvesting what vegetables were ready. By midday, her back and shoulders ached from the unaccustomed labor, but there was satisfaction in the physical work that had been absent from her teaching duties. She prepared a simple lunch, then continued her exploration, walking the perimeter of the immediate property until she discovered a small stream about a quarter-mile from the house. The water was clear and cool, flowing over smooth stones. Catherine removed her shoes and stockings, lifting her skirts to wade in the shallow current. The cold water soothed her aching feet, and for a moment, she felt a freedom she hadn't experienced since childhood. On impulse, she unpinned her hair, letting the auburn waves cascade down her back in the warm breeze. "It's a good spot for thinking." Catherine whirled around at Matthew's voice, nearly losing her balance in the stream. He stood on the bank, holding the reins of his horse, his expression apologetic. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said, leading his horse to drink upstream. "I often stop here on my way back to the house." "It's beautiful," she replied, quickly gathering her skirts and stepping out of the water. She reached for her hairpins, embarrassed to be caught with her hair down like a schoolgirl. "Leave it," Matthew said softly. "If you don't mind, it suits you." The compliment brought color to her cheeks, and she lowered her hands uncertainly. No man had seen her with her hair down since she was a child, save for Uncle James when he dragged her by it during his rage. "How was your morning?" she asked, changing the subject as she sat on a rock to dry her feet, productive. "The cattle are doing well, though I lost some time tracking down a stray calf." He loosened his horse's saddle to let the animal rest. "And yours?" "I weeded the garden and gathered eggs," she replied. "I hope you don't mind, but I also explored the barn and chicken coop." "It's your home too, for as long as you choose to stay," he reminded her. "You're free to go wherever you like on the property." The casual declaration of her freedom touched something deep within Catherine. All her life, she had been told where she could go, what she could do, how she should behave. First by well-meaning parents, then by increasingly controlling relatives. Even as a teacher, her movements and actions had been strictly regulated by the school board and social expectations. "Thank you," she said softly, "for that and for," she gestured vaguely to her fading black eye, "for not asking." Matthew was quiet for a moment, his gaze on the flowing stream. "My mother had bruises like that," he finally said, his voice low. "Not on her face, my father was too clever for that. But I saw them when she rolled up her sleeves to wash or when her collar shifted. I was 10 when he finally drank himself to death, and I remember thinking it was the best day of my life." He looked up at her, his eyes clear and direct. "So I don't need to ask, Catherine, I've seen enough to know." The matter-of-fact way he shared his story without seeking pity or displaying shame loosened something in Catherine's chest. She found herself speaking before she'd made a conscious decision to do so. "It was my uncle," she said, her voice barely audible above the burbling stream. "After my parents died of influenza, he took me in. He was respected in the community, a deacon in the church. No one would have believed." She swallowed hard. "He wanted me to marry his business partner, a man older than he was, with a reputation for cruelty to his servants. When I refused, he—" She touched her fading bruise. "This was the first time he struck my face. Usually he was more careful." Matthew's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his voice remained steady. "How did you get away?" "I had been saving from my teaching position." "Not much, but enough for train fare and to answer your advertisement." She looked down at her hands, twisting in her lap. "I left in the night 2 weeks ago. He'll be looking for me. He doesn't like to lose what he considers his property." "He won't find you here," Matthew said with quiet certainty. "And if he does, he'll regret it." Catherine believed him, and the realization startled her. In the short time she had known him, Matthew Young had shown himself to be a man of his word, steady, reliable, and unexpectedly kind. The sort of man she had given up believing existed outside of novels. "We should head back," Matthew said, standing and gathering his horse's reins. "Storm clouds are building to the west." Catherine quickly put on her stockings and shoes, then gathered her hairpins. As she reached to twist her hair back into its proper arrangement, Matthew's hand gently caught her wrist. "You don't have to," he said. "Not on my account." Their eyes met, and something shifted between them, not quite desire, but the acknowledgement of its possibility. Catherine lowered her hands, leaving her hair loose, and accepted Matthew's help onto his horse. He swung up behind her, his arms encircling her to hold the reins, and they rode back to the ranch in companionable silence. The following weeks established a routine as Catherine settled into ranch life. She rose early each morning to prepare breakfast before Matthew headed out for his chores. She tended the garden, cared for the chickens, and kept the house in order. Mrs. Winters continued to visit 3 times a week, but gradually transferred more responsibilities to Catherine as the older woman recognized her competence. Catherine's bruises faded, along with some of her wariness. She found herself laughing more, particularly in the evenings when she and Matthew would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sunset while he told stories of his early days in Kansas. She learned of his journey west at 18, his years working as a hired hand on other ranches until he could afford his own land, his dreams for expanding the herd and building a larger barn. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her love of teaching, and her passion for books. Matthew listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When she mentioned missing her collection of books left behind in Philadelphia, he rode into town the next day and returned with 3 volumes from the general store. Nothing remarkable, just popular novels, but the gesture moved her deeply. In early August, Catherine accompanied Matthew to town for the first time since her arrival. She was nervous about facing the curious stares of the townsfolk, but Matthew's steady presence beside her provided comfort. "People will talk," he warned as they approached El Dorado in the wagon. "They always do, but you hold your head high, Catherine. You've done nothing to be ashamed of." The general store was their first stop. Mr. Wilson, the proprietor, greeted them warmly, though his eyes lingered curiously on Catherine. "Miss Mason, it's a pleasure to finally meet you properly," he said, extending his hand. "Matthew here has been singing your praises for weeks." Catherine felt her cheeks warm as she shook his hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Wilson." As they shopped for supplies, Catherine became aware of whispers and glances from other customers. Matthew stayed close, his hand occasionally touching the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. They were leaving the store when a woman's voice called out, "Miss Mason, Catherine Mason." Catherine turned to see a thin, severe-looking woman approaching rapidly. "Yes, I'm Mrs. Abigail Potter, head of the school board," the woman announced. "I understand you were a teacher in Philadelphia." "Yes, for 3 years at the Fairmont Girls Academy," Catherine replied, surprised. Mrs. Potter nodded briskly. "Miss Daniels is returning east at the end of the month, earlier than expected. We find ourselves in need of a teacher immediately. Would you be interested in the position?" Catherine glanced at Matthew, who nodded encouragingly. "I would be very interested, Mrs. Potter." "Excellent. The school term begins in 2 weeks. Please come to my home tomorrow afternoon to discuss the details." With that, Mrs. Potter marched away, leaving Catherine stunned by the sudden opportunity. "Congratulations," Matthew said as they continued to the wagon. "You'll make an excellent teacher for El Dorado." "You don't mind?" she asked. "It would mean being away from the ranch during the day." "Why would I mind you doing something you love?" he responded, helping her onto the wagon seat. "Besides, we could use the extra income with winter coming." His casual inclusion of her in his future plans sent a pleasant warmth through Catherine's chest. Despite her initial reservations, she had begun to envision a life here with Matthew not as the desperate escape she had first intended, but as a true partnership. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance over the prairie, Catherine found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Matthew, why did you advertise for a mail-order bride? You're handsome, successful, kind. Surely there were eligible women in El Dorado or the surrounding areas." He was quiet for a moment, considering his answer. "There were," he admitted. "But most women out here are looking for a businessman or a banker, someone who works in town, not a rancher who comes home smelling of cattle and sweat." He smiled ruefully. "And I'm not good at courting. I never know the right things to say. Writing letters was easier. I could think about my words, make sure they came out right." "Your letters were wonderful," Catherine said softly. "They gave me hope when I needed it most." Matthew turned to look at her, his expression serious in the gathering dusk. "Catherine, we've known each other for nearly a month now. I've come to care for you deeply in that time, but I haven't pressed you about our arrangement because I wanted to give you time. But I need to know, do you still wish to marry me? Or would you prefer to remain as you are, independent with your teaching position?" Catherine's heart raced at the directness of his question. In Philadelphia, such forthrightness would have been considered vulgar, but here in Kansas, she found it refreshingly honest. "I want to marry you, Matthew," she answered, her voice clear and certain. "Not because I need protection or security, though I'm grateful for both, but because I've come to care for you as well, more than I thought possible in such a short time." The smile that transformed his face made him truly handsome. "Then marry me tomorrow. Reverend Collins can perform the ceremony after Sunday services." "Tomorrow," Catherine laughed, both thrilled and scandalized by his eagerness. "What will people think?" "They'll think exactly what they've already been thinking, that you've been living here as my wife in all but name," he pointed out pragmatically. "We might as well make it official and stop the gossip." "You make a compelling argument, Mr. Young," she teased, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Very well. Tomorrow it is." They were married the next day in a simple ceremony attended by half the town, curious to witness the union of the quiet rancher and his mysterious mail-order bride. Catherine wore her best dress, a deep green that matched her eyes with wildflowers gathered that morning serving as her bouquet. Matthew wore a new shirt and his least worn pair of trousers, his face freshly shaved except for his neatly trimmed beard. The moment when he slipped his mother's gold band onto her finger felt sacred to Catherine, not just the sealing of a practical arrangement, but the beginning of something profound. When Reverend Collins pronounced them man and wife, Matthew's kiss was gentle but held the promise of deeper passion to come. That night, as Catherine stood nervously in their bedroom now, shared, Matthew approached her with the same careful respect he'd shown since her arrival. "We don't have to do anything you're not ready for," he said softly, his hands resting lightly on her shoulders. "I can sleep in the spare room." Catherine silenced him with a finger to his lips. "I'm not afraid of you, Matthew," she whispered. "I never have been." It was true, she realized as he lowered his mouth to hers. Despite her past, despite the rational fear she should feel in the presence of any man after what she'd endured, Matthew had never triggered her instinct to flee. From the moment he'd promised that no one would touch her again, she had believed him not just that he would protect her from others, but that he himself would never hurt her. Their lovemaking was tentative at first, both learning each other's bodies with reverent exploration. Matthew was patient, gentle, and when they finally joined as husband and wife, Catherine found healing in his tenderness that she hadn't known she needed. Afterward, as they lay tangled in the sheets with the prairie breeze cooling their skin through the open window, Catherine traced the scar that ran along Matthew's ribs, a souvenir from a stampede years earlier. He'd explained. "I never thought I could be this happy," she confessed in the darkness. "After everything, I didn't believe it was possible." Matthew's hand covered hers, pressing it against his heart. "You deserve happiness, Catherine, and I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." "As I do for you," she promised, sealing the vow with a kiss. The years that followed were not without challenges. The winter of 1876 was particularly harsh, with blizzards that trapped them in the house for days and threatened the cattle. Catherine's first classroom proved challenging, with students ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, all with different levels of education and interest. Matthew's plans to expand the herd suffered a setback when drought affected the summer grazing. But through it all, they faced each difficulty together. Catherine's intelligence and education complemented Matthew's practical knowledge and determination. They worked side by side during the day and held each other close at night, building a life that neither had dared to hope for. In the spring of 1877, Catherine missed her monthly courses. By summer, her condition was confirmed, and Matthew's joy was boundless. He built a cradle from oak and lined it with the softest flannel he could find in Dorado. Catherine continued teaching until her advancing pregnancy made it impractical, then turned her energy to preparing for their child. On a cold January night in 1878, after 18 hours of labor with Mrs. Winters and the town's midwife in attendance, Catherine gave birth to a healthy son they named James, after Catherine's father. Matthew wept openly when he first held his son, overwhelmed by the miracle of the tiny life they had created together. "He has your eyes," he told Catherine, sitting beside her on the bed as she recovered from the ordeal. "And your chin," she replied, touching the cleft in their son's tiny chin that matched his father's. As James grew, the ranch prospered. Matthew's careful management and Catherine's frugal habits allowed them to purchase additional acreage and expand the herd. They added a room to the house, then another when their daughter Elizabeth arrived 2 years after James. In the summer of 1882, as they celebrated their 7th wedding anniversary with a picnic by the stream where they had first truly connected, Catherine received a letter that made her hands tremble. "What is it?" Matthew asked, immediately alert to her distress. "It's from Philadelphia," she said, scanning the contents. "My uncle is dead. Apparently he left everything to me, his only living relative." She looked up, her expression a mixture of disbelief and grim satisfaction. "He never found another housekeeper to replace me, died alone." Matthew took her hand. "Are you all right?" Catherine considered the question seriously, reflecting on the journey that had brought her from a bruised and terrified young woman to the confident wife and mother she had become. She looked at their children playing by the stream, James trying to catch minnows with his bare hands while Elizabeth toddled after butterflies, and at the man who had kept his promise that no one would ever hurt her again. "I'm more than all right," she said, leaning against his shoulder. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Matthew pressed a kiss to her temple, his arm secure around her waist. What will you do about the inheritance? Sell it all, she decided firmly. Use the money to build that new barn you've been planning and put the rest aside for the children's education. She turned to face him fully. My future isn't in Philadelphia, Matthew. It's here with you and our children. It always has been, from the moment I stepped off that stage coach with a black eye and found a good man waiting for me. I'm the fortunate one, he countered, cupping her face in his weathered hands. You gave me a family, Catherine. You made this ranch a home. As the sun set over the Kansas prairie, casting long golden shadows across the land that had witnessed their journey from strangers to beloved partners, Catherine Young knew with absolute certainty that the desperate gamble she had taken 7 years earlier had been the wisest decision of her life. The mail-order bride with a black eye had found not just safety, but love, respect, and a life fuller than she had ever dared to dream possible.